I also love to write, and I love nonfiction. I love history, and I try to get my passion for history into these books. And this is a book about, not about Islam the religion, but about Islamic civilization and its deep historical connections to the West, which pretty much have been forgotten, long acknowledged for centuries up until about the 1500s, and then forgotten. And so I talk about what the connections are in art, philosophy, engineering, medicine, astronomy, architecture, food, and then why we don't know about any of that anymore. Because if you look at a middle school text, and it talks about Islamic civilization, it pretty much says Rome fell, Muslims translated all the knowledge of the Greco-Roman world into Arabic, sat on it for 1,000 years, gave it back to the Europeans after the Renaissance, and then that's pretty much it. You might get a paragraph or a page, but that's more or less the gist. Scholars have known for a long time that none of this is like original research, this is secondary research, that the connections are much deeper and broader than that. And so that's what this book tries to do. And it uses the National Geographic format. I worked for National Geographic and NASA during my years as a freelancer, where you have compelling images, fascinating captions, and succinct text. So you go from pictures to captions to text, and lots of air, so that you can read this book in probably 45 minutes, or half an hour if you're a fast reader. And then and at the back I have a pretty thorough bibliography with websites and everything in here I painted, all the maps I did in Photoshop and Illustrator. I did the initial layout for this, and then I worked with a designer at Random House to make it. If you wonder why it's so thin, a color picture book like this, for it to sell for under $20, it has to be less than 48 pages. 48 pages or less. Parents don't like to spend more than $20 on a book for their kids. So you can go over that price and the sales plummet. So that's why. So I had to learn to write very succinctly, pack a lot of information into each sentence, but not so much information that it was daunting. The vocabulary has to be at a certain level. The images have to be very accessible. Some of the chapters in this book I wrote 5 and 6 times when the editor said, "I have no idea what you're talking about. If I don't understand it, a middle schooler isn't going to understand it." So that's the story of this book. Sales have been brisk. It's been translated into Arabic. We're looking at it being translated into Malay Indonesian. It's been probably, of all the books that I've written and illustrated, it's probably been the most successful and had the most impact. Got me here to Boston. So from Kuwait, which is where I'm living now. I've been here for the last year and a half. I want to write other books about the Islamic world. I want to write more books about Islamic history, and all of my experience had been in Southeast Asia. And to have street cred, to really talk about Islam in its fullness, I really needed to spend time in the Middle East. I got an opportunity to teach at the American International School in Kuwait and jumped on it. And so I teach in the International Baccalaureate program there for like I said, the last year and a half. This is real. And it's called Toxoplasma gondii. It's a tiny microscopic animal that lives in the ground and wants to live in cats. Because in cats, it can reproduce sexually. It can reproduce asexually in any other mammal, in ferrets and whales and dogs and in people. To get from the dirt into cats, it produces a chemical, and if a rat happens to ingest toxoplasma, it produces this chemical that, like Prozac, has an impact on mood and behavior. And what it does in the case of rats, who are normally quite afraid of cats because cats eat rats, they like cats. And they start seeking out cat urine, and consequently they get eaten, which is exactly what toxoplasma wants. And once it's inside the cat's body, it travels to the cat's brain, just as it does in the rat, travels to the rat's brain, and it reproduces the way it wants to. Now, if it gets in other mammals besides rats or cats, it behaves differently. If it gets into people, it affects us differently depending on gender. So for statistical purposes, since it affects half the human population, half of you are infected,
and half of you aren't. So what does toxoplasma do to infected males versus uninfected ones? Well, infected males are, they test a little lower on IQ tests. They're more morose, they're more jealous, they have less of a chance of getting promoted. They're less willing to buckle under to authority. Now, how about uninfected females versus infected females? Well, infected females test a little higher on IQ tests than uninfected females. You're more open, you're more caring, you're more likely to have multiple relationships. And both genders are socially more conservative than the uninfected and more risk adverse. Now, as it happens, since we're here in the United States, probably only about 10% of you are infected, statistically speaking, because of the hygiene culture in this country, and because that we don't have a culture of eating raw meat. In countries that do, in parts of the Middle East, parts of France, infection rates are much, much higher, 60, 70, 80, 90%, depending on your age. In Japan, it's about 20%, and in different countries of the world, it goes up and down. But like I said, the average is about 50. So here, it's your chances of infection are low, and even if you were infected, if you have a healthy immune system, you'd probably be unaware, because once you get infected, the protist moves into the brain, where it covers itself with like a waxy coating that makes it pretty impervious to the body's immune system, or awareness of the body's immune system, and it produces that chemical. But our immune system is able to keep the numbers of it quite low. Now, if your immune system is compromised, for example, if you've had a transplant, you're taking immunosuppressant drugs, if you have AIDS, which impacts your immune system, then it will reproduce quite vigorously, and you get toxoplasmosis. And you can get toxoplasmosis, dementia, and if you happen to be a fetus who doesn't have an immune system, it can cause a severe brain damage, which is why infected women are not supposed to change cat litter. So I mention this because, as you can see, microbes, in this case, a protist, a multicellular microscopic animal, can have an unseen impact on the way we interact. And this has been true with many different diseases, many different pathogens, many different parasites throughout human history. And I want to talk about that interaction today, and how it has shaped our behavior, shaped our culture, and shaped who we are. Till today. But the one that's, I think, even more interesting are the cholera pandemics of the 19th century. We're concerned now because this pandemic has gone on for a couple of months. Those pandemics would go on sometimes for a decade. I mean, there were 6 of these cholera pandemics that swept through the world again and again and again, initially starting in Calcutta, and then from there, because of trade and because of the troop movements of the British Empire, swept around the world again and again and again. And they forced governments to start taking care of their citizens. Initially in London, and then in other European cities, and then in New York, and then eventually everywhere. Initially, before the cholera pandemics, governments it wasn't their job to supply clean drinking water, or proper sewage facilities, or to clean up the streets, or to provide housing for the poor, or public education, or public parks, or any of the things, or paved roads. None of that was was a given that you were expected to provide. And initially there was a lot of resistance. England in 1832, when the cholera pandemics really started roaring through there, there was big separation between the classes, and between the poor and the rich. And the rich took care of themselves, and the poor, they were pouring into the big cities because the enclosure acts had made it impossible for peasants to survive in the fields. So they were, and so if you look at you want to talk about problems with inequality. If you were poor, you were likely to die at age 20. And if you were middle class, you might make it to 30. And if you were rich, you might make it to 40. This is on average, just because of not just of cholera, but of diphtheria and typhoid and typhus and all the other illnesses. But anyway, so it forced Parliament to start taking seriously, well, what as people are dying, normal death rates were 60 a day. They're dying at 600 a day, 700 a day, 800 a day. Just like today, they can't bury the bodies fast enough. They can't build the coffins fast enough. And it completely overwhelms the medical system of the city. So it forces lawmakers to say, what do we do differently? And it happened to be, at that time, there was a brilliant public health official. He wasn't a public health official then, but he became one, named Edwin Chadwick. And he said, rather than treating the poor the way we are, where they're in tenement apartments, crammed into rooms, no windows because there was a high tax on windows, no access to clean water or to anything except maybe an outhouse that might serve 60 families and be cleaned out once a decade. Let's change this. Oh, the other thing, of course, is that at that time, if you were too poor to afford your own funeral, you were your body became the property of the state, and you were dissected. And so this was to provide medical schools with bodies. And he said, rather than treat the poor this way, why don't we make them functioning citizens? And initially, I think one of the things Parliament said was this was mawkish philanthropy. But then another cholera pandemic would come through. People start dying at these outrageous rates, and that starts to change attitudes. And so the reason we have a welfare state in so many countries in Europe today, and the sort of the tattered welfare state that we have here, is because of that. It's not out of altruism. It's not because people feel a sense of obligation towards helping everyone. They were forced to. And you hear that term, we're all in this together. Well, that's really where people learned it. And it wasn't out of a month or 2 months or a year. It was out of almost an entire century of being hammered by cholera. This early 19th century was the era of the Romantics. It was a response to classicism, neoclassicism, which had developed with the discoveries of at Herculaneum and Pompeii in Italy, and the Enlightenment, and a belief that there were rational answers to everything. The Romantics didn't like that way of this rational, thoughtful, analytical way of dealing with the world. They believed that the best life was one that was passionate and fiery and short. And so tuberculosis became the disease that was favored by the Romantics. There were lots of very celebrated poets and artists and writers who had tuberculosis. Like I said, 1 in 4 Europeans had it. They didn't know that it was transmittable, as we know today, by close contact with someone who had it. In fact, Europeans believed that at the time that it was a hereditary disease. And so since people like Robert Louis Stevenson and the Bronte sisters and Frederick Chopin and Aubrey Beardsley, these were all famous artists and writers of the day, since they all had it, if you got it and your children got it, this was considered a good thing, kind of like getting a good SAT score today, because getting TB was considered a sign of artistic genius. One of the things that it caused was this thinning out of the body and also these inflamed cheeks. And going back to Roman times, inflamed cheeks were considered a sign of inner artistic fire. So was red hair. So someone who was redheaded or someone who had fiery red cheeks was thought that there was this inner artistic fire that was burning inside you.
My job is all about teaching DP and MYP students art thinking, art making, art history, and art curation. I teach students to think visually and analytically in a nonlinear fashion. Transferring that skill to other disciplines can help students develop unconventional solutions to problem solving. I want to enable each student to be the best artist they can be, pushing them beyond their own self-imposed limitations. One of my real joys in the classroom is introducing students to a variety of exciting kinds of art making that open their eyes and their minds to what it means to be a contemporary artist in the world today. Here we have bird paper, which was the email of its day. So we always have the World Wide Web of its day, and now we have the email of its day. And this was very thin light paper that you could write messages on and put in a little backpack on a pigeon and send that pigeon off to the Sultan could find out what was going on in various parts of his domain. Translation. The Great Translation Project was the Human Genome Project of its day. Everyone's heard of Aristotle. He's considered the founder of Western civilization. Well, in my painting of Aristotle here, he has all these cracks on his face and these different colors. What I'm trying to suggest in this illustration is that the Aristotle we know is not really one person. He's a composite personality made up of Muslim translator after Muslim translator after Muslim translator, because there is no original Greek Aristotle extant in the world today. The oldest Aristotle that we have today is in Arabic. It's an Arabic translation with commentaries, and that's not even the earliest. It was a translation with commentaries from an earlier version, from an earlier version, from an earlier version. So when we look at Aristotle today, we're really seeing him through a multitude of Muslim lenses as they tried to figure out what he was saying and comment on it and stretch it and squash it and take it from the original Greek into Syriac and from Syriac into Arabic. Muslims encountered Aristotle in that great library at Alexandria. And they noticed that there were the Greek philosophers that were being stored in that one library were saying things that seemed like things that were being said in the Quran. And so there was this idea that if Muslims, if they translated all the ancient Greek knowledge, it would buttress, back up, show that the ancients, that a lot of the knowledge in the Quran was connected to the ancient world, and this was like universal knowledge what the ancients knew was also was revealed in the Quran as well. This project really got underway during the Abbasid Empire. And the idea was to translate everything from the ancient Greek world, to take all of ancient knowledge and turn it into Arabic, plus all the knowledge of ancient Babylon, plus all the knowledge of Persia, plus all the knowledge of China, plus all the knowledge of India, everything that Muslims get their hands on for 1 century in the place called the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. You would bring in manuscripts. Whoops, let's go backwards there, sorry. Got a little ahead of myself. Okay, you would bring in manuscripts, and they would be read, and then they'd be translated into Arabic, and they'd be turned from the rolls into these codexes here. So this is my suggestion of what the Beit al-Hikmah looked like. If you were a translator in those days, this was a great gig to have. You were worth your weight, literally worth your weight in gold. The best translators would stand on a scale, and gold would be piled up on the other side, and that was their payment for the year. And the great men of Baghdad would compete to get the favor and they'd try to get commissions of the greatest translators and get them to work for them. No, I want you to work for me, I'll pay you more, that sort of thing. And then 500 years later in Spain, during what's called the Convivencia, which was when Christians, Jews, and Muslims were living in relative harmony in Spain. And this is also during the Reconquista, as Christians are slowly reconquering the Muslim parts of Spain. There was an effort by one of the Christian kings in Toledo to translate all of this knowledge that had been translated from Arabic into Latin. And it's this retranslation project here that really kickstarts the Renaissance. There are really 3 points of contact between the Muslim world and the Western world. One of them is in Sicily, one of them is in Constantinople, which became Istanbul. But one of the really most important points, because of that competition between the Umayyads, the Western Umayyads, and the Abbasids, is in Spain. And really, a lot of the books that get translated, you can see directly discoveries in astronomy that happen in Europe right after a book gets translated from Arabic into Latin. Discoveries in lens making, discoveries in mathematics. Every time these books start getting translated, you see leaps in European understanding. And often Europeans sometimes actually claiming the books for themselves. There was a great sort of cottage industry of going down to Spain and finding a book on, say, the astrolabe and translating it into Latin and saying, look what I discovered. So this was something that occurred during the sort of the beginnings of the Renaissance. And really, it's my contention that this is what really lit the fire of the Renaissance. Europeans were ready for it, but once their knowledge of the ancient Greek world, plus 1,000 years of Muslim building on that foundation, is really what got things going. And this is the title page for my current project, which is called This Changes Everything. Maybe this will be like a visit to Stonehenge and a look back in time to when people were just the same as people are now, but they did things differently.